The morning my head of talent walked into my office and placed a resume on my desk, she said, "This one is unusual. 5 pages. Overexplained. She's either extremely accomplished or extremely anxious, possibly both." She set it down and left. I looked at the name on the top of the page. I sat with it for a moment the way you sit with something that arrives from a direction you were not facing. Not shock exactly, more like the specific feeling of a story you thought was finished, opening a new chapter without asking your permission. The name was Celestine Okafor Webb. Celestine had kept my last name after the divorce. I had not asked her to. I had not asked her not to. I had simply, in the way I had learned to simply do things in the years that followed the end of our marriage, let that be her decision and moved on. Celestine had been my wife for 11 years. During those 11 years she had told me, with the specific confidence of a woman who had decided she understood the full landscape of a situation, that what I was building was not going to work. That the pivot I was attempting, from the consulting work that had been our primary household income, into the software development and artificial intelligence infrastructure that I believed was the future of everything, was a risk she was not willing to underwrite with her patience or her presence. She had not been unkind about it. That is the thing I always want to make clear when I tell this story. She had not been cruel. She had simply been certain. And the certainty of a person who has decided they understand the math of a situation, even when the math they are working from is wrong, has a particular weight to it that is very difficult to carry inside a marriage while also trying to build something the world does not yet have a name for. She left in year 11. She said, "I cannot keep waiting for something that may never arrive." The company had been incorporated for 8 months at that point. It was now 7 years later. 7 years in which the company had grown from an 8-month-old incorporation with 2 employees and a product that existed primarily in my own mind, into something that occupied 3 floors of a building in the technology corridor, employed 112 people, had completed a Series B funding round, and was, at the moment Celestine's 5-page resume arrived on my desk, in active conversation with 2 enterprise clients whose names, if I said them out loud, you would recognize immediately. She did not know I had built this. That is the part that requires explanation, because it is not as simple as a man who hid his success from his ex-wife. It is more specific than that, more human than that. The company had a name that was not my name. It had been built under a structure that, for reasons I will explain, had kept my direct involvement private during the years when private was necessary for the company to grow correctly. I had not been in the newspapers. I had not been at the conferences. My name was not on the website in any visible place. I had been building, as I had always built, from the inside out. Celestine had applied to my company because she needed a job. She had applied not knowing whose company it was. She had sent 5 pages because she was trying very hard to make an impression on a company she believed was exactly the kind of opportunity that did not come twice. She was not wrong about that last part. My head of talent was waiting for my decision. I looked at the 5-page resume on my desk. I made a decision. This is that story. My name is Raymond. I grew up in Houston, Texas. My mother was a database administrator for a large energy company, one of the first Black women in that role at her organization, a fact she mentioned rarely, and a fact I thought about often. My father ran the IT systems for a regional hospital network. They were, both of them, people who understood technology not as a novelty, but as infrastructure, as the invisible architecture beneath the visible world. I grew up inside that understanding. Computers were not impressive objects in my household. They were tools. The impressive thing was what you could make them do, and more specifically, what problems you could solve if you understood both the tool and the problem with equal depth. I was a programmer before I was anything else. Self-taught initially, then formally. I studied computer science at Rice, went on to a master's in computational systems, and spent the first decade of my career working at the intersection of enterprise software and data infrastructure. The kind of work that is unglamorous and essential, and that most people who use technology never think about. The plumbing of the digital world. I was good at it, better than good, in the specific domain I had staked out, the architecture of systems that needed to learn from data in real time and make decisions faster than human operators could. What we now call AI infrastructure. What in those early years had a dozen different names and no clear commercial category, and was regarded, by most of the business world I moved through, as interesting, but not yet serious. I believed it was serious. I had believed it since my late 20s when I started to see, in the systems I was building for enterprise clients, the embryonic version of something that was going to be transformative at a scale most people were not yet prepared to imagine. I spent 5 years building the technical foundation before I built the company, reading, developing, consulting on the side for clients who were willing to pay for someone who could build systems their own teams could not. Every dollar I earned went back into the development. I was patient in the way that people who are certain about something can be patient, not because waiting is comfortable, but because rushing would compromise the outcome. I met Celestine at 32. She was 31. She was working in marketing strategy at a consulting firm, smart, decisive, socially gifted in the way of someone who had learned to read rooms and manage narratives with the precision of an engineer managing a system. She understood positioning and story and the specific way that ideas become powerful when they are communicated correctly. I fell for her because she was brilliant in a way that was complementary to mine. Where I lived inside systems and structures and the patient architecture of technical problems, she lived in the human dimension, what people wanted, what moved them, how to get from a good idea to a room full of people who believed in it. We were, in theory, perfectly suited for what I was building. In practice, the gap between theory and what Celestine could see in our daily life was wider than either of us had calculated. The early years of the marriage were good. We were both working. We were building a household. The work I was doing on the company, still pre-incorporation, still in the long technical gestation period, was present in our lives as a thing I worked on in evenings and on weekends with the persistent, unhurried commitment I brought to everything. She was patient at first, genuinely. She believed in me. I believe she believed in me. But belief has a time horizon, and the time horizon of a person who lives in the fast-moving world of marketing strategy, where ideas are tested, validated, and deployed in cycles of weeks and months, is not the same as the time horizon of a person building infrastructure that requires years of foundational work before anything visible is produced. By year 6, she was asking questions. Not unreasonable questions. When? How much? What does the timeline look like? What is the point where we know? I answered as honestly as I could. I said I did not know exactly when. I said the foundation was being built correctly. I said the payoff was real, but the timeline was mine to manage, and I would not be moved off what was correct by what was urgent. She heard in that answer something I did not intend. She heard, I matter more to this than you do. She heard, your timeline is not relevant to mine. I meant, the work has a right pace, and I respect it enough to hold to it. She heard, you are not the priority. I have had years to understand that gap. It does not make either of us wrong. It makes us two people whose fundamental orientations to time and outcome were not as compatible as we had believed when we were dating. By year 9, she was exhausted. By year 10, she was absent from the marriage in the way of someone who has made a decision but is waiting for the right moment to say it. In year 11, she said it. I did not fight the divorce. I understood it. I signed what needed to be signed. We divided what needed to be divided fairly. She took her career. I kept the company, which at that point was 8 months old, had 2 employees, and occupied a desk in a shared workspace that charged $400 a month. She walked out of our marriage into what she believed was the clear and correct decision. I walked into the next 7 years of the most concentrated work of my life. There were 3 moments, 3 specific, datable, locatable moments that tell the story of what 11 years of that marriage felt like from the inside. I am going to tell you about them because they are the context for everything that came after, and without the context, the story is just money and coincidence. With the context, it is something else, something worth understanding. The first moment happened in year 4. I had come home from a meeting with a potential investor. A small meeting, not a Series A, not anything close. An early-stage conversation with an angel investor who had heard about my work through a mutual contact and wanted to know more. I had given the pitch. I had been, in my honest assessment of my own performance, precise and convincing about the technical landscape and the opportunity. The investor had said he needed to think about it. I came home with the particular energy of a person who has had a conversation that mattered. I wanted to tell Celestine. I wanted to share it, the way people share things in marriages when the marriage is a place where sharing is possible. She was in the kitchen. I started telling her about the meeting, the investor's background, the questions he had asked, the part where he had leaned forward slightly when I described the data processing architecture, which I had taken as a signal of genuine engagement. She was making dinner. She was listening in the way she sometimes listened, with part of her attention, the part that was not managing the pasta and the timing of 3 different things on the stove. She said without turning, "Do you know what his fund size is? Because if it's under 20 million, he's probably not worth the time. You need institutional money eventually, Raymond, not angels who write $50,000 checks and then want to be on your board." I said, "It was a first meeting, Celestine. It wasn't." She said, "I know, I'm just saying, you spend a lot of time on conversations that don't go anywhere. You need to be more selective about where you put your energy." I looked at her back, at the efficient movement of a woman managing a kitchen and a conversation, and in some part of her mind, an assessment of her husband's professional decision-making simultaneously. I said, "Okay." She said, "How long did you spend with him?" I said, 3 hours. She turned around. She looked at me with the expression she had when she was trying not to say what she was thinking and was not succeeding. She said, "Raymond, 3 hours. For a first meeting with an unvetted angel, that's a half day of your consulting billing." I said, "I know." She turned back to the stove. I went to my desk in the second bedroom, and I sat down and I opened my laptop, and I worked until she called me for dinner. I did not tell her about the investor again. The investor passed, as it happened. But what stayed with me was not his decision. What stayed was the 3 hours. The way the 3 hours had been described. Not as time invested in something important, as billing foregone on something probably not worth it. The second moment happened in year 7. We were at a dinner with 2 other couples, both of them in Celestine's professional network. The conversation was the kind of conversation that happens at those dinners: careers, ambitions, trajectories. One of the men was a managing director at a consulting firm. The other was a partner at a marketing agency. Someone asked me what I was working on. I said I was developing AI infrastructure for enterprise data processing. The managing director asked a few questions. They were good questions. He had enough technical literacy to engage with the surface of the answer. I started to go deeper. Celestine said, "Raymond can talk about this for hours. We'll be here all night." She said it warmly, with a laugh. The table laughed. I smiled. I shortened the answer. The conversation moved on. In the car driving home, she said, "You do go on about it. They were being polite." I said, "He was asking real questions." She said, "He was being sociable. There's a difference." I looked out the passenger window at the city going by. I said nothing. But I stored it. The way I stored everything. With the particular thoroughness of a person who understands that the accumulation of data points eventually produces an accurate picture, even when no single point is definitive on its own. The third moment was the one that finished things. Not dramatically, quietly. The way the last stone lands on a structure that was already compromised. Year 10. We were talking about the company. One of those rare evenings when we were both at the kitchen table with no particular agenda, and the conversation had found its way to the thing that was always present, but rarely addressed directly. She said, "I need you to tell me honestly, is this going to work?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I have been building the right foundation, and the market is moving toward what I've built. It's a matter of timing, not direction." She looked at me. She said, "Raymond, I have heard some version of that answer for 7 years. Timing, not direction. I understand what you're saying, but from the outside, from where I live, I cannot see what you see. I don't know if that's because it's not visible yet, or because it's not there." I said, "It's there." She said, "How much longer?" I said, "I don't know exactly." She said, "That's the problem." She got up, she washed her glass, she went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table alone. I thought about the investor meeting, about the managing director at the dinner, about 7 years of conversations that had been cut short or dismissed or converted, in the telling of them, into evidence of a husband who talked too much, about something that was probably not worth the time. I thought about the company, about what I knew about it that she did not know, about the foundation I had been building and what it was going to produce. about the specific, technical certainty I carried, not hope, not optimism, but the engineering certainty of a person who has done the work correctly and understands what correct work produces. I thought about timing. 1 year later, she told me she was done waiting. I said I understood. She filed. The company was 8 months old. The divorce was final on a Thursday. On Friday, I went to the office. I am telling you that because it is accurate and because accuracy matters. There was no dramatic pivot, no moment of converted grief becoming fuel. I just went to the office because the office was where the work was, and the work was what mattered, and it had always been what mattered, and the divorce, for all the weight of it, did not change that fundamental fact. What changed was the weight I was no longer carrying. I want to be honest about that. The marriage had been, in the last 3 years of it, a significant drain on the specific resource I needed most. Not money, not time, though it consumed both. The resource it drained was certainty. My own certainty about what I was building, and why, and whether the timeline I was operating on was correct. Celestine had not destroyed my certainty, but she had made it expensive to maintain. Every conversation about timing, every dinner party comment, every billing foregone calculation had required me to spend some portion of my own conviction defending what I already knew. And that spending, over years, had accumulated into something I had not fully noticed until I stopped having to do it. When I stopped having to do it, I noticed what was available. I went faster. Not recklessly. I was never reckless. But the pace of the work changed in the first year after the divorce in a way that I have thought about many times since. I had more of myself. Simple as that. The part of me that had been running maintenance on other people's confidence in what I was doing was now available for the doing. I hired 3 engineers in the first month after the divorce. I made a product decision I had been deferring for a year and a half because it required full commitment to a technical direction that, once taken, could not easily be reversed. I took the direction. It was correct. By year 2 post-divorce, the company had a product that worked. By year 3, we had our first paying enterprise client. By year 4, we had completed a Series A. I kept my name off the public-facing materials for reasons that were structural and strategic. The company's public face was our chief product officer, a woman named Danielle who was brilliant and presentable and whose name and background made sense in the market we were entering. I was the builder. I was always the builder. I did not need to be the face. The building was the point. My name appeared in the founding documents, in the cap table, in the legal structure, not in the press releases, not in the LinkedIn announcements, not in the industry profiles. I was, to the world outside the company and its investors, the same person I had always been to most people who knew me, a technically excellent consultant who did careful work and did not make a lot of noise about it. Celestine and I did not stay in contact after the divorce, not hostilely. There was no hatred, no war, no reason to maintain connection either. We had been 2 people without children who had built a marriage and, finding it no longer workable, had parted. We parted cleanly. We moved in separate directions. I did not think about her often. I want to be accurate about this because the story is easy to tell as something it was not. Easy to tell as a man nursing a wound, building in anger, waiting for the day he could show her. That is not what happened. What happened was simpler and less romantic. I built because building was what I did. I moved forward because forward was the only direction that made sense to me. She was behind me. Not in a cruel sense, in the directional sense. I was moving forward and she was part of what had been left behind. 7 years passed. Then my head of talent walked in with a 5-page resume. I want to tell you what was in those 5 pages. Not to catalog her failures. She had not failed exactly. She had made decisions, and the decisions had not produced what she had expected them to produce. And that is not the same as failure, even if it feels the same from the inside. She had left the consulting firm 2 years after the divorce. She had taken a senior marketing role at a technology startup that had been, in those years, regarded as one of the more promising companies in the consumer AI space. The company had not survived. It had shut down in a manner that the industry press had described as a controlled wind-down, and that anyone reading between the lines understood to mean something less controlled than that. She had taken a second role. That company had gone through a significant restructuring. Her position had been eliminated. The 5 pages were the document of a person trying to make 11 years of varied experience cohere into something that looked like a linear ascent. It did not entirely cohere. But the underlying experience, when I read it with the eye of someone who understood what the actual skills were beneath the titles, was genuinely significant. She knew technology marketing. She understood positioning. She understood how to take something technically complex and make it legible to the people who needed to buy it. She was exactly what my company needed at this stage of its growth. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked my head of talent to proceed with the standard screening process. First round interview, video call. No mention of the founder's involvement in the candidate review at this stage. I was going to let the process work correctly. And then, at the final stage, when she was sitting in the interview room, I was going to walk in. Not to be cruel, not to watch her face. For the reason that had always been the reason for everything I did. Because it was the right thing. Because she was qualified. Because the company needed what she had. And because some conversations need to be had in person, in a room where both people are fully present and the full truth is visible. I had built something real. I was done being invisible inside it. The final interview was scheduled for a Tuesday at 2 o'clock. The room was a conference room on the second floor. Clean and well lit, the way we kept every room. Not expensive, not ostentatious, functional and serious. A long table, 6 chairs, water glasses, a screen on one wall for presentations. The kind of room that signals, this is a place where real work gets done. Danielle had conducted the first 2 rounds with Celestine. She had briefed me after each one. Her assessment had been consistent. Strong strategic thinking, excellent communication instincts, some gaps in technical depth that were not disqualifying at this level. She said, "She's good, Raymond. She's the kind of person who makes the room smarter." I had said, "I know." Danielle had looked at me. She knew, by that point, why this candidate was different. I had told her. Not everything, but enough. She had said, "Are you sure about this?" I had said, "I am sure about her qualifications. The rest I will figure out in the room." Danielle had nodded. She understood what I was and was not saying. The final interview was scheduled as a panel. Danielle, our head of growth, and one of our senior engineers, whose work intersected most directly with the marketing function. 3 people already in the room when the candidate arrived. The plan was that I would join late. A last-minute addition, framed by Danielle as the founder wanting to close with a brief conversation. Celestine arrived at 1:55. I know this because Danielle texted me. She wrote, "She's here. She's composed. She's dressed well. She has printed copies of a leave-behind she prepared." I read that and sat with it for a moment. A leave-behind. She had prepared a leave-behind. She was trying hard. She had sent 5 pages and prepared a leave-behind and arrived 5 minutes early, and I understood, reading those 3 facts together, what the last 2 years had looked like from the inside. At 2:38, Danielle texted again, "We're wrapping, coming to get you." I had been sitting in my office. I had not been reviewing documents or handling email. I had been sitting there, thinking about 11 years, about the investor meeting and the dinner party and the kitchen table question, about year 11 and the 8-month-old company and the desk in the shared workspace that charged $400 a month, about 7 years of building something real while being invisible inside it. I stood up. I walked down the hallway. I could see the conference room through the glass panel in the door. 3 people on one side of the table, 1 person on the other. The one person was sitting straight in her chair, her hands folded on the table, her leave-behind visible on the surface beside her. She was saying something, and the 3 people across from her were listening. Danielle opened the door from inside. She said, "We have one more person who'd like to meet you." I walked in. I want to describe what happened on Celestine's face, and I want to be precise about it, because I have gone over it many times, and precision matters. The first thing was recognition. Immediate, complete recognition. The specific snap of a mind that has been in conversation with a room and has suddenly encountered something outside the frame of what it expected. Her eyes moved to my face and recognized me in the first fraction of the second. The second thing was calculation. I saw it. The rapid interior processing that Celestine had always done, the specific competence of a woman whose mind moved quickly through the implications of what she was seeing, what this meant, what room she was actually in, what company she had actually applied to, whose name was on the founding documents of the organization she had spent 2 rounds of interviews trying to impress. The third thing, and this is the one I carry, was something I did not expect. It was not embarrassment. It was not anger. It was not the sharp, social panic of a person who has been caught in something humiliating. It was recognition of a different kind. The recognition of a person who is seeing, clearly and completely, the distance between what they believed was true and what was actually true. The specific look of someone revising a 7-year-old calculation in real time and arriving, at the end of the revision, at a number very different from the one they had been working with. She said my name. I said, "Hello, Celestine." The room was very still. Danielle and the others had the particular quality of people who understood they were witnessing something that had nothing to do with the interview and did not know whether to stay or leave. They stayed. I sat down at the table, not at the head, to the side where the panel was. I did not position myself above her. I sat across from her the way I had sat across from her 1,000 times in 11 years of marriage, at a table, as an equal. I said, "I read your resume." She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "Raymond." A pause. "What is this company?" I said, "It's what I was building." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The infrastructure project." I said, "It grew." Another silence. She looked at the table. Then she looked at me. She said, "How long?" I said, "Incorporated 8 months before you filed. 7 years of operation since." She absorbed that. I could see her doing it. The 7 years sitting on top of the 8 months sitting on top of 11 years of marriage, and the timeline question she had asked me at the kitchen table in year 10. "How much longer, Raymond?" "I don't know exactly," she said quietly. The Series B. She had done her research before the interview. She had read whatever was publicly available about the company. The Series B had been announced with Danielle's name attached, but the funding amount had been public. I said, "Yes." She said, "You did it." I said, "We did it. The company did it. 112 people did it." She looked at me. I said, "Your resume is strong, Celestine, genuinely. You have skills this company needs. Danielle and the team will give you their honest assessment through the normal process, and if the role is right for you, it is right for you on the merits." She said, "You would hire me." I said, "I would hire the right person. If that's you, it's you." She said, "After everything." I said, "The company doesn't run on after everything. It runs on what can you do and do we need it." She looked at her leave behind on the table. Then she looked at me. She said, with the specific directness that had always been one of her truest qualities, "I was wrong about the timeline." I said, "You were working with the information you had." She said, "I was wrong about you." I looked at her. I thought about the investor meeting, about the dinner party, about how much longer, about the billing foregone, about 3 hours described as a half-day of consulting billing. I said, "You weren't wrong about the man you knew. You were wrong about where he was going." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Is this going to be strange? If I work here?" I said, "I don't do strange. I do work." Something moved across her face that I had not seen in a very long time. Something almost like the expression she had worn when she believed in me, the early version, the version from before the time horizon closed in and certainty became expensive. Something that said, "I see you, all of you, and I am not going to look away this time." She said, "I'd like to be considered on the merits." I said, "You already are." Danielle said, "We'll be in touch by Thursday." We were. What she said to her sister that evening on the phone, going through every detail of what had happened in that room, that is a story for another day. I want to tell you the truest thing I know about those 7 years. They were not lonely. I think people expect me to say they were lonely. The man who lost his marriage and poured himself into the work and came out the other side successful, but isolated, that is a clean story. It has the right shape for the version of this tale that is primarily about triumph. But it would not be accurate. Those 7 years were full. Full in the way that only work that is completely yours can fill you. The specific fullness of a person who is building something they believe in without having to spend any portion of that belief defending it to someone else. I had the work. I had the team. I had the particular community of people who build things together, engineers and product managers, and the slowly expanding network of colleagues and partners who were drawn to what we were creating and who created alongside us. I was not waiting. I was not pining. I was not running a 15-year campaign of quiet revenge that culminated in a conference room in the third-floor interview suite. I was building. That was always the whole of it. Building because it was what I knew how to do, because the work was real and worth doing, because the foundation I had laid was sound, and the structure going up on it was going to be something the world needed. Celestine's 5-page resume arrived not as the moment I had been waiting for, but as a coincidence with very specific weight. The coincidence of a woman who had once made a reasonable decision based on incomplete information arriving, 7 years later, at the door of the thing she had decided was not going to be worth waiting for. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it. Have you ever had someone tell you the ceiling of your work before the work was finished? Have you ever had someone you loved and respected look at what you were building, at the foundation, the early framework, the messy, incomplete middle of it, and perform a calculation that told them this was not going to be worth the wait? Not cruelly, not with bad intentions, simply with the honest assessment of a person whose time horizon ran out before the work did. And did you believe them? Even partially, even just enough to spend some portion of your own conviction defending what you already knew instead of simply doing it. Even just enough to let the question, is this going to work? How much longer? How do you know? Live inside the building process as a slowing weight. I spent years paying that tax, patiently, without complaint, because the person levying it was not wrong to ask. The questions were reasonable. The answers I had were true. The gap between the reasonable question and the true answer was just wider than a marriage could comfortably hold. I am not telling you to leave everyone who does not understand your timeline. Some of those people will grow with you if you stay and keep building and keep showing them the work as it becomes visible. Some of those people will come around before the last brick is laid. I am telling you this, the work does not require their belief to proceed. It requires yours. Your certainty about what you are building is the only certainty that matters during the building. Other people's doubt is information about their picture of the situation. It is not information about the situation itself. Those are different things. Learn to tell them apart. Celestine's picture of what I was building was not wrong because she was a bad person or a limited person. It was wrong because pictures made from the outside of a building under construction will always be incomplete. You cannot see the foundation from outside. You cannot see the load-bearing walls. You cannot see the design intent in the half-finished frame. You see what is visible. What is visible in the early years of serious work is almost never the point. The point is underneath. The point is in the foundation. The point is in the patient, unglamorous, undiscussed work of getting the structure right before you worry about how it looks. My mother was one of the first Black women in database administration at her company. She did not talk about that much. She did the work. She built expertise quietly and methodically, and over 30 years, she became someone her entire organization depended on in ways they had not fully understood they would depend on when she started. She once told me, "Baby, the infrastructure is always more important than the interface. What holds the thing up matters more than what the thing looks like from the street." I have thought about that sentence in every significant decision I have made in the last 20 years. The infrastructure is always more important than the interface. Build the foundation correctly. Hold it patiently. Let the building rise at the pace the building requires. The room will see it eventually. They always do. Celestine starts in 3 weeks. The role is Head of Market Positioning, a title we created for this specific function because what she does not fit cleanly into any title that already existed. She will be good at it. She was always going to be good at something like this. She needed a company that was doing something real enough to be worth positioning. She has one now. I am not a man who confuses professional respect with anything else. We are colleagues. We were other things once, and we are colleagues now, and the clarity of that distinction is part of what makes it workable. She asked me once, in the weeks between the interview and the start date, whether I had been surprised when I saw her name on the resume. I said, "Surprised is not quite the right word." She said, "What is the right word?" I thought about it. I said, I felt like the story knew what it was doing, even when I didn't. She looked at me. She said, "That sounds like something you would say." I said, "It sounds like something that's true." And then we went back to work. Because that is what we do. Because the work is always where it starts, and the work is always where it comes back to, and the foundation is always more important than the interface, and the building is still going up, and the view from the top is worth every year of patient, invisible, unglamorous, essential work that made it possible. If this story felt familiar, if someone has ever looked at the middle of your work and decided it was the end, subscribe. I will be here next week with another story about builders and believers and the distance between what people see and what is actually being built. You are not at the ceiling, you are at the foundation. Keep going.